Can everyone hear me with this? Welcome to the 2024 University City Public Library Adult Summer Reading Video Challenge. My name is Kara Kreckler, and I'm the head of Adult Services here at the library. And I'm so excited that you all have chosen to read the African Trilogy with us this summer. It was written by acclaimed novelist and poet Chinua Achebe. And these three books show us how Western colonialism has impacted Nigerian villages over the course of 3 generations. The response to this year's titles has been amazing, so much so that we have more people than books at the moment. If you weren't able to get a copy of the book tonight, we will have more available within the week, so just sit tight. They're really short books, so hopefully it'll get to you quickly. If you'd rather not wait though, and would like to buy one yourself, please grab one from our friends down the street at Subterranean. So this summer, in addition to our discussions, we have a great lineup of programs related to these books to help give us context to the African Trilogy. The first cultural program will be Drums and Voices of Nigeria, which is an all-ages program created just for us by the Emmy Award-winning storyteller Bobby Norfolk. He'll be accompanied by drummer Kenya Ajanaku to help bring the folk tales of Nigeria to life for us. That event will take place right here at 6:30 p.m. on Wednesday, June 12th, and it is free and open to everyone. We will also welcome the Spirit of Angela West African Dance and Drum for a performance on July 17th, and a lecture and demonstration of African jewelry making by Kenya Ajanaku on August 7th. All of the times and dates for these events are in your reader guide, on your bookmark, and of course on our website. So before I hand the program over to our keynote speaker, a few housekeeping notes. If you need them, restrooms are out the door back there and to your left. Feel free to grab some snacks while you're back there. And also, I hope everyone grabbed a survey on your way in. If you could fill those out at the end of tonight's program and just leave them on the table back there, it helps us plan and secure funding for more programs in the future. So now I am thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Joya Uraizee, who will introduce us to Chinua Achebe, visionary storyteller. Dr. Uraizee is a professor of English at St. Louis University, where she teaches African and post-colonial literature and film. She is the author of 3 books: This Is No Place for a Woman, Nadine Mortimer, I should have asked how to pronounce these, Nayantara Sakal, Mbuchi Emechet, oh my goodness, and The Politics of Gender, In the Jaws of the Leviathan, Genocide Fiction and Film, and Writing That Breaks Stones, African Child Soldier Narratives. She is currently working on a manuscript on African child refugee narratives. She has also published several articles on same-sex desire in East African cinema, memory in African cinema, migrant African children, and religious fanaticism in Bollywood movies. Dr. Uraizee is also currently president of the African Literature Association, an international organization that promotes African literature, writers, and artists to a worldwide audience. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Joya Uraizee.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And actually, the African Literature Association conference just met this weekend, and my term as president just ended. Oh. So I'm now what we call immediate past president. Okay, and I also took a sneak peek at this, so I know you have a lot of the information, but I wanted to start by thanking, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
By thanking Kara and her team at the UCity Public Library. It's an honor to talk about a man I've admired for decades and whose life work has literally been it's been an it isn't just a fan club, it's just his writing has had such an influence on so many writers that he's sort of always present whenever we talk about African literature. And I'll start by saying I had the privilege of sitting next to him for dinner. SLU actually invited him many years ago when I was my hair was all black, and he was invited to receive the St. Louis Literary Award in the 1990s, and I introduced him, he gave a great talk, and I had dinner with him. And it was lovely, just being in his presence. So I thought I'd start today by, so my sort of title for him is a visionary. I see him as a visionary storyteller, and I do think that he has changed, literally put African literature on the map single-handedly. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to start by a little bit of a segue into his writing. Towards the middle of one of Achebe's later novels, and I'll start by saying, I brought all of them. I carry them around a lot, but you guys in the trilogy have, of course, this one, Things Fall Apart. Then you have this one, Arrow of God. And you have this one, No Longer at Ease. But in my opinion, you also should read these two. So this is the fourth one, A Man of the People. And then we have, in many ways, in my opinion, his finest novel, Anthills of the Savannah. So they're all here, and we'll talk about that. So one of his later novels, Anthills of the Savannah, in that novel, one of the protagonists, a man named Ikem, who is a writer by profession, delivers a lecture to a group of young university students. The event takes place in the country of Kangan, a fictional version of Nigeria, and in his lecture, Ikem elaborates on what he calls, quote, the imperative of struggle, unquote, against political oppression. At the end of the lecture, his host, who is affiliated with the university, thanks him for his time and eloquence, and then accuses him of merely documenting social problems without giving solutions. Ikem, this fictional character, keeping his cool, replies, quote, writers don't give prescriptions, they give headaches. This statement to me sums up Achebe's own agenda in a nutshell. Achebe documents cultural and political problems and implies rather than actually suggests appropriate solutions. I think he really did believe that that isn't the writer's job to give solutions. That doesn't mean the solutions aren't there, it means that they're not explicitly there. So, in my talk today, I would like to explain why I think Achebe was one of the world's finest writers. He was a visionary who showed via fiction that it was possible to think beyond the usual binaries of us and them, black and white, oppressor and oppressed. To me, Achebe's importance as a man of letters stems from what eminent scholar Simon Gikandi has labeled his ability to, quote, propose an alternative world beyond the realities, imprisoned in colonial and pre-colonial relations of power, unquote. And I think Achebe approaches alternative worlds in four ways. By rewriting African history, by having a political vision that is distinctive, through a unique worldview, and primarily, of course, by being a master storyteller. As far as rewriting African history is concerned, Achebe's purpose, as he stated repeatedly, has been to write for his own people the history and legacy of his own culture. I know you have some of that history in your handout, but I thought it's important to point out a few things about Nigerian history. Of course, Nigeria is, the full title is the Federal Republic of Nigeria. It is situated in Western Africa. Its capital is Abuja, and its main export is oil. With more than 103 million people, it's also Africa's most populous nation. There are over 250 ethnic groups in Nigeria, each with their own language. The main languages are Hausa, Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo, while English is the country's official language. Muslims make up about half the population and Christians make up the other half. Between the 9th and 16th centuries, Nigeria comprised many kingdoms and states. Of course, Africa had many glorious kingdoms before the Arabs got there, or definitely before the Europeans did. Some of the kingdoms were the Hausa state of Kano, the Yoruba state of Ife, the Edo state of Benin. Arab traders brought Islam to Nigeria around the 10th century, and many kingdoms in the northern section of Nigeria embraced Islam. Between the 16th and the 18th centuries, Portuguese traders arrived, and soon after the transatlantic slave trade began. In the 1840s, British traders arrived, and it is during this time that things fall apart is said. If you look in your handout, it sort of says that. I'm going into a little more detail than that. So around this time is when things fall apart is said. By 1861, Lagos had become a British colony, and the British missionaries set up missions in the south. So Christianity spread primarily in the south. This is, of course, when Arrow of God is set. So although Arrow of God was written third, it's set second, if you see where I'm going with that. By 1900, Nigeria came under direct control of the British, so in other words, the British ruled it directly. And by 1914, Nigeria became a British colony. Soon after that, Western education and Christianity spread rapidly in the south, and this is when No Longer at Ease is set. Eventually, on October 1, 1960, Nigeria became independent. This is when the man mentioned in your handout, Alhaji Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, a Hausa Northerner, became Prime Minister. And this is, of course, when the fourth book that you're not reading, but I recommended, A Man of the People, is set. In 1966, Balewa was assassinated, and in 1967, the eastern region of Nigeria, led by Lieutenant Colonel Chukwumeka Odumegu Ojukwu, seceded from Nigeria and named itself Biafra. So basically it was a civil war. Between 1967 and 1969, civil war raged in Nigeria until finally in 1970, Biafra surrendered. In the process, almost 2 million civilians, mostly Igbo civilians, died from starvation, basically. It was mostly starvation, some massacre. In 1975, Brigadier Murtala Muhammad Muhammad became head of state, and he was followed by a series of military dictators. This is when Antlers of the Savannah, the last book of the 5 main novels that he wrote, was set. So basically, Antlers of the Savannah is about Nigeria under a military dictatorship. In 1979, Alhaji Shehu Sagari became president and a civilian government took over. This period was also known as the Second Republic. In 1983, Shagari was removed in a coup. Unfortunately, again, there was another coup led by Major General Muhammadu Buhari, who became head of state. Buhari was followed by a series of military dictators until finally in 1999, the Third Republic, heralded by Olusegun Obasanjo, becoming president, took place. So Nigeria is now, of course, no longer a military dictatorship. However, the Nigerian people have been very much terrorized by a militant group called Boko Haram, which has been abducting schoolgirls, killing hundreds of people, and making life difficult for the average Nigerian. The current president of Nigeria, in case you're interested, is Bola Tinubu, and he was elected in last year. So it's a presidential form of government, and it's a democracy. So how does this fit with Achebe? Well, Achebe's novels that are set in the past, that is the distant past, showcase a society in which balance between faith and commerce is achieved. I think the word balance is mentioned in your handout. Balance, I think, matters to Achebe a lot. By contrast, the novels that are set in slightly later periods, that is post-independence Nigeria, reveal a society in which commerce dominates. So in other words, with independence comes greed, essentially, is his take on that. In his essay called The Trouble with Nigeria, Achebe attributes the problems of the country not to the Nigerian people, but to what he calls, quote, a failure of leadership. the unwillingness or inability of its leaders to rise to the responsibility, to the challenge of personal example, which are the hallmarks of true leadership, unquote. So what does a writer do when confronted with a government in which leaders don't rise to the occasion? Well, what Achebe says is that the writer's role in such a context is to regain the beauty and depth of his native culture, as well as to be a thorn in the side of the government. You can do both, in other words. At the beginning of his first novel, Things Fall Apart, as you know, Europeans have not yet had an influence on Umuofia, the group of 9 villages in southern Nigeria. So in other words, most of the action is set in this group of 9 villages called Umuofia. And as you know from having read Things Fall Apart, the European influence is just being felt at the start of that novel. However, by the end of the novel, British laws and religion have made an indelible mark on the whole of Nigeria. The villagers in his third novel, remember it's his third novel, but it's set earlier, Arrow of God, in that case, the villagers are ruled by and under the absolute control of British colonial leaders. So in other words, although the protagonist of Arrow of God is an Igbo priest, he has really no power other than the power of God, essentially. He has no political power whatsoever. The people who are in control are the British. There's a slight shift in the second novel, which he wrote. In other words, he wrote that novel second, but it's set third, No Longer at Ease, in that the action unfolds just prior to the granting of independence to Nigeria. So if you've read that novel, you'll see there are plenty of exchanges between the protagonist and his British boss. And the British boss keeps saying, well, I don't know if you guys can really handle independence and all that. So basically, it's about to happen in that novel. Then in A Man of the People, the one that isn't in your book, but is set later, we are in Nigeria just after the British have left, and just before the Civil War breaks out. And finally, in Anthills of the Savannah, we are face to face with a military dictator who is later, at the end of the novel, that military dictator is deposed by another one. So one of the main characters in Anthills of the Savannah is a dictator character, basically. These 5 novels, in my opinion, form a continuum of time that spans about 100 years, focused mostly on Igbo culture. They tell the story of Nigeria in terms of important historical events, such as, the coming of the Europeans, the establishment of Warren Chiefs, the struggle for independence. But they also show, of course, how the idea of a national community can be given a narrative framework. So in other words, the fact that those 5 novels span that history suggests that he had his own way of breaking up those time frames in a very entertaining and narrative format. But Achebe does much more than just provide us with a narrative framework for history. He shows us, of course, how ordered and dignified the lives of villagers in pre-colonial Umuofia were in the early sections of Things Fall Apart. As he said in one of his essays, quote, as far as I'm concerned, the fundamental theme of Things Fall Apart is that African people did not hear of culture for the first time from the Europeans. That their societies were not mindless, but frequently had a philosophy of great depth and value and beauty, that they had poetry, and above all, that they had dignity. It is this dignity that the African people all but lost during the colonial period, and it is this dignity that they must now regain, unquote. So in other words, he sees it as his job. He doesn't offer solutions, but he does offer a way that Africans can be proud of their culture and their heritage. This focus on the Igbo world explains why he spends a lot of time in Things Fall Apart describing everyday life. So if you notice the first part of Things Fall Apart, nothing much happens, right? But that's because he wants to show you what life was like then. What is Umuofia? It is a democratic agrarian society governed by rules and customs and characterized by festivals and ceremonies. What is remarkable about these beautiful sections of the novel is that they were also historically accurate. As scholars have noted, quote, the Igbo were proud of not having kings. So in other words, it was a community in which there was no concept of kingship. The village groups were not subordinate to a central authority and lived in a segmented society constituted on the same lines at every level. It was a community that involved direct democracy, where every citizen had a say. Decisions were negotiated. The ideal of all transactions was balance, right? So you have to balance the individual and the communal, men and women, every other aspect of it. So some of the festivals he describes in Things Fall Apart, if you recall, are the Yam Festival, right? Why the Yam Festival? Because the yam was the main crop, the main food. How do they celebrate that? The whole village celebrates. They have songs and feasts, and it goes on for a while. Another festival he describes in Things Fall Apart is the Week of Peace, if you recall. That, of course, Okonkwo comes out of that. No one, not even the elders, are allowed to indulge in violent or aggressive behavior during the Week of Peace, and so of course that is partly why Okonkwo is punished, because he violates that. Reading these sections, in my opinion, not only vividly recreates Igbo village life in the 19th century, but it also suggests that it was a harmonious existence. No doubt it had its flaws. No doubt there were drawbacks, right? The way Osu were treated, the way twins were treated, the way women were treated. But at the same time, it was a culture that had a deep sense of belonging and a deep sense of bonding. And it was this bonding and cohesion that was ultimately destroyed by colonization. And by the way, I think it's tremendously to Achebe's credit that faced with all the racist stereotypes he had of that Europeans had of African culture, he actually shows you both the strengths and the weaknesses of his own culture. In other instances, Achebe critiques social evils like the oppression of women or the misuse of power by politicians. In No Longer at Ease, for example, the protagonist, if you've read that novel, the protagonist is the grandson of the protagonist of Things Fall Apart. He's a young man who's been educated in England. His name is Obi. So in No Longer at Ease, Obi arrives at his new job in the colonial civil service and eventually gets an invitation to a party at the house of a minister who goes by the name of the Honorable Sam Okoli. He is the Minister of State. Obi finds out that the minister's house is quite luxurious. He recalls reading a newspaper article that described the controversy that had ensued when the press found out that the government had spent £35,000 on new houses for each of the ministers. So in other words, one of the first lessons Obi learns as a new civil servant is corruption is endemic in the colonial civil service. Likewise, in A Man of the People, the Minister of Culture in that novel has no idea who the best writers in the country are. And he's been appointed the Minister of Culture. He can't even name an author. And what he does eventually is he takes away the water pipes from villagers who don't support his candidacy. So he promises them new water pipes, and as soon as they vote for somebody else in the election, he takes them away. So this is all Achebe critiquing what was going on. Achebe uses his fiction to call his fellow countrymen to action, to make a change that will have a lasting impact on their cultures. At the end of the last novel, Anthills of the Savannah, for example, Beatrice, who is the protagonist, who survives political persecution by the military dictator, organizes a naming ceremony for a baby girl, whose mother, Eliwa, is her domestic servant. In a reversal of traditional male-centered religious ceremonies, she chooses a male name, Amaechena, for a female child. In this sequence, Achebe seems to be calling for a decentering or a changing or an end to sexism and class-based oppression. In other words, at the end of his last novel, Anthills of the Savannah, the old order is gone, and a new order that seems to be much more amorphous in the sense the nuclear family is gone, women are much more in control of society, and he leaves that for us to figure out at the end of that novel. One of the other ways in which I had said at the beginning that Achebe is a visionary is his political vision. So he doesn't just chronicle and critique the culture of his people. He's been a trenchant voice throughout his life. He was a trenchant voice of criticism against political corruption and political activism. Your handout says he actually living in Nigeria became untenable for him for that reason, and he ends up on the East Coast and actually died in Boston. He was not, in other words, welcome back for his outspokenness. In his collection of essays entitled The Trouble with Nigeria, Achebe points out that Nigeria's main problem, as I said before, is lack of leadership. But in what way is leadership lacking? It's complacent. It has not solved the problems of tribalism and social injustice and ethnic prejudice. And so, of course, Achebe takes all of those up in his novels. All of his novels deal with conflict on the individual and communal level. However, it's important to note that there are lots of differences from novel to novel. The violence that the villages in Things Fall Apart encounter, for example, is very different from the violence that the villages deal with in No Longer at Ease and Arrow of God. Things Fall Apart, as one critic suggests, shows pre-colonial village groups averting violence among themselves. It presents an alternative to the law, right? So in other words, in Things Fall Apart, except for right at the end, whenever there's a conflict, the villagers try to resolve it to the best that they can themselves. What has happened by the time he writes Arrow of God and No Longer at Ease? The military comes in to solve the problems. So there's a distinct difference in the way problems are solved from novel to novel. Both No Longer at Ease and Arrow of God deal with the abuses of political power. No Longer at Ease chronicles the social and moral decline of its protagonist Obi, and I think Obi in many ways is sort of a microcosm of pre-independence Nigeria. Achebe presents Obi to us as a flawed character, and again I want to sort of point out this is one of the reasons why I think he's a visionary, because his characters are flawed. They have defects, and Achebe is quite at pains to point both the strengths and the weaknesses out. So if you find, as you read that novel, that you don't particularly like Obi, that's okay. I don't think you're meant to be to see him as necessarily a heroic character. In many ways, he's an anti-hero. Obi, what are some of his flaws? He doesn't recognize the sacrifices the Lagos Igbo community made to raise the money to support his scholarship to get a master's degree in the UK. So in other words, he's ungrateful. He gets community support to go study in England, and then he's sort of scornful of them. He makes matters worse by insisting on marrying, he wants to marry a woman named Clara, who despite being mobile and educated is an Osu. In other words, she is still considered by her culture to be, the lowest of the low. Eventually, when his finances fall apart, he accepts bribes. If you haven't read the novel, I don't want to spoil it for you, but basically bribery and corruption, as you may have guessed, is throughout that novel. And the quote I have here is just one section where he's sort of trying to figure out, should I or shouldn't I, and what if I accept a bribe, what's going to happen? And this is what he says. He accepts the money, but, quote, leaves the wad of notes where he had placed it for the rest of the day and all night. Obi placed a newspaper over it and secured the door. He did not go to sleep at night for a long time. And eventually, as you know, he gets into a lot of trouble for accepting that bribe. But the point is that I think one of the things that Achebe is trying to show through his character is all the pressures that come to bear on a character who has benefited from Western education, but is also very deeply rooted in his own culture, and pressure basically pulls him apart. He can't handle it. And so, of course, the novel ends badly for him. And finally, Arrow of God is partly about, of course, it's about the priest Ezeulu, who is the protagonist. But again, Ezeulu is far from an ideal character. Most of the novel, he's presented as extremely jealous of his fellow priest, right? So most of his efforts in the novel are being in competition with the other guy, right? and of course against the British. But notice what happens when Ezeulu is arrested for refusing to comply with the British. He sees this not as a victory, which you would have expected, right? He's won up the British. So you'd expect him to go home and celebrate. Instead, he sees this as an opportunity for revenge against his rival. In one sequence of Arrow of God, just before he leaves prison, he's been arrested, he says, "They say I betrayed them to the white man. And then, but I want to wrestle with my own people. I'm going home to challenge all those who have been poking their fingers in my face to come outside the gate and meet me in combat." So in other words, he wasn't just saying, "Look at me, I defied the British." He says, "How dare you challenge me who have defied the British?" So his energies get spent on one-upping his rival as well. What is his revenge? I don't want to spoil it, but again, his revenge isn't hand-to-hand combat, but starvation. He refuses to announce the date of the next new yam festival, which is their way of saying Harvest Day. And no one harvests their yams which lie rotting in the fields, and the villagers face starvation. So he uses his own religious power, which is, I'm not going to declare Harvest Day. You guys go to hell. You can't harvest because I've said it's not Harvest Day yet. Who cares? In desperation, the villagers, of course, end up converting to the white man's religion, right? Because that's the only way they could harvest their yams. So at the end of the novel, basically, he single-handedly, in some ways, was responsible for the destruction of the old way of life. And I think, again, it's to Achebe's credit that he shows a flawed protagonist bringing on destruction himself. A Man of the People, however, in my opinion, is Achebe's most sustained analysis of the loss of power and the evils of corruption. The whole tone of the novel is pervaded by an atmosphere of unrestrained acquisitiveness. So what Achebe is documenting in that novel is how with independence comes corruption. Achebe uses two metaphors to express this. And I couldn't resist showing you this. I got this off of a magazine. It sort of underscores what he's saying. The ship of Nigeria is afloat, the pot-bellied politicians are bringing it down, and guess who's trying to keep it afloat? Poor people who don't have much to wear. So that is sort of his point here. So the two metaphors. So how does Achebe talk about political corruption? He does that by using the metaphor of the national cake. Politicians in that novel, the two names in that quote are two politicians in that novel. They are always presented in the novel as greedy eaters. Right? They eat the national cake as a reward for a political office. So that's one way in the novel, and through many other novels, the metaphor of eating becomes a metaphor of corruption. The other one